page. Hey everybody, it's good to see a lot of familiar faces and excited to talk to you about a little bit of what we've been working on really just for the past few months. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Um, well, I'm excited to talk to you guys about Wildmon and especially a case study that we're working on in Indonesia, in Kalimantan, to combining technologies and working directly with community designed initiatives there. Since we are a brand new organization, we just launched in May, I'd love to give a super quick overview of the organization, then we'll dive into the case study. So, Wildmon is a nonprofit organization that is totally dedicated to building scalable technologies specifically for frontline conservationists. So, our team has been working in the field for quite a long time now and have sort of discovered that there's a real need to develop conservation technology, biodiversity monitoring technology. Sorry, my dogs. Hang on one second. It's constant. Um, Developing biodiversity monitoring technology specifically for projects on the ground. It's currently really expensive, really complex. You need to be a scientist, a data scientist, a coder to be able to collect data from the fields and then get it all the way through to useful metrics to understand what's happening. So the goal from the organization is really to design a whole pipeline around taking projects from raw data collection all the way through to useful metrics and outputs. I'm sorry. Hopefully they're almost done. Um, and as we all know, there's a massive biodiversity data gap that currently exists, and largely in tropical ecosystems where so many of these projects are already happening. There are people doing incredible work, and there's just a need to really empower local projects to collect this data and then go all the way through to analysis and results. Our goal is really, as I mentioned, to remove all barriers for frontline conservationists around deploying these technologies and then moving that data all the way through these pipelines from analysis to final metrics, indicators, and reporting. Our team, as I mentioned, has been working in this space for quite a long time. So I've been working with this team for close to a decade now, especially around acoustic monitoring. So we've been deploying these projects in countries around the world for many years, and we're excited to be launching this nonprofit alongside Jorge Ahumada. Him and his team built the Wildlife Insights platform for camera trapping analysis. So similarly, a cloud-based data processing platform that makes it accessible for anyone to process camera trap imagery. And then Sujeevan Ratnasingam out of the International Barcode of Life, him and his team built the Bold and Embrave platforms for DNA metabarcoding. So they house about 80% of the world's metabarcoding information, and also similarly are working to make these tools fully accessible for science and conservation globally. So the goal and our expertise is really around these data pipelines, taking raw recordings, camera trap imagery, samples from the field, all the way from raw data through to species presence information. And our team's real vision is how do we build a full data pipeline that makes it so that any projects on the ground are able to collect this information, combine it, and then get the metrics and results they need to inform action, and then also to drive resources to the projects that are really creating impact on the front lines. They're super complementary. Camera trapping, acoustics, and eDNA, you're capturing birds, frogs, bats, mammals, insects, and then megafauna on the ground from camera traps, and then also insect health, aquatic species. So the three together really paint a super comprehensive picture of biodiversity health across ecosystems. We are already working in many countries around the world, partnering directly with projects on the ground. The goal is to create sustainable long-term monitoring projects that are totally locally led. We're also learning a lot as we go so that we can really inform how are we building out these processing pipelines so that conservationists have all the tools they need to manage their own projects, implement these technologies, and then have sustainable solutions to continue to collect long-term data and get the metrics they need to inform impact. So this ranges from monitoring corridors in Brazil to understand how effective those are across the Amazon, Cerrado, Atlantic forests, monitoring protected areas to see how climate change is impacting where protected areas need to be placed, agroforestry projects, looking at things like rubber plantations to understand how different approaches are impacting biodiversity. And the case study I want to talk about today is in Indonesia, which is specifically around community-led solutions for biodiversity. And I will dive into that one now. So the genesis of the partnership, we're working with Planet Indonesia and the Dayak communities in Kalimantan in Indonesia to essentially monitor a lot of the community-led reserves there to understand how the practices they've been implementing for a long time are impacting biodiversity presence, and to inform some new practices that they're hoping to implement in the next few years. And this all really started just through connections in the field. So it really speaks to the need for building this network. Really grateful to Nature Tech Collective for kind of leading the charge on bringing a lot of these folks together, because so much of the work we do is just through connections and people sharing our work and then wanting to collaborate. And so we've built a lot of what we do just based off of talking to people and kind of bridging gaps. The project scope, we're working again with Planet Indonesia and 8 diet communities in Gunung Naning forests in West Kalimantan. The goal is really to create a sustainable approach for scalable biodiversity monitoring there that helps the local communities who are already doing a tremendous amount of work there really understand the impact of that work, and then to also inform some upcoming practices that they're working on, such as no-take zones and creating agreements around land ownership, and then deciding exactly where no-take zones should be placed in Indonesian forests. So from a technical standpoint, we are implementing 3 different types of data there alongside Planet Indonesia. So acoustic monitoring, camera trapping, and then satellite imagery. From the acoustic standpoint, we are using song meter micros, and then we're using the Wildmon's acoustic workflow to process all of that data to get from the raw recordings to species identifications, and then combining that with environmental climatic factors. From a camera trapping standpoint, we're using Bushnell camera traps, and then utilizing the Wildlife Insights processing platform to get to species identifications there. And then we're also collaborating with Planet on satellite imagery, which is super exciting because we're going to be able to combine those climatic, environmental factors with species detections from the field to really understand comprehensively what is happening with biodiversity across these community-led forests in Kalimantan. So what that looks like, we have a paired design in which we're deploying camera traps and acoustic monitoring sensors across 100 sites across the community-led forests. We're then developing AI models to really refine the species detection algorithms across those sites. So for the acoustic recordings, we're developing a new convolutional neural network to be able to isolate species recordings, and then using the Wildlife Insights AI model for camera trap image processing. We're also looking at soundscape analyses, so using various indices along from individual species detections to also soundscape indices to really understand how that forest ecosystem is changing. That'll also be helpful because we're doing seasonal sampling, so we'll be deploying in the rainy and dry season for 2 years to start, so we'll be able to see kind of what those seasonal differences and variances look like. And then we'll be using various ecological modeling approaches to understand how species presence and distribution are influenced spatially and seasonally across those community-led forests. Some of the focal species include the Bornean white-bearded gibbon, the orangutan, the helmeted hornbill, and the pangolin. The reason we wanted to use acoustics and camera traps, and a big focus of what we're trying to do is figure out what are the types of sensors that are needed for different project applications and how are you really optimizing the types of data you're collecting. It was important across this project site to be capturing species that are quite vocal, like gibbons and hornbills, but then there are also focal species that are not vocal, like pangolins and wild pigs. So that is why the kind of acoustics and camera trapping paired design was decided on. So we're really excited to see what the results look like across these species, and then we're focusing on about 60 species total for the project. So again, some of those outcomes are the development of the AI model for the acoustics. This will make for a long-term project so that the project can continue using these AI models into the future, hopefully with less and less help from us, so that you can have a really sustainable long-term project. And then we're focusing on 60 key species of interest, looking at distribution, presence, richness, occupancy, composition, alongside those soundscape indices. And then one of the biggest goals is really local capacity building. So how are we creating as much training on utilizing the hardware as possible, and then also on the entire pipeline so that the local communities can have as much agency in making use of these technologies is possible. And that also creates a much longer term sustainable monitoring project. So the impact, there's already incredible work being done by Planet Indonesia in these communities. Climate smart agricultural practices, they've implemented public health services. A big part of what they do is securing land rights for indigenous communities. And as I mentioned, one of the biggest outputs of this project is to help inform no-take zones. So agreements are being signed between local communities around no-take zones. So if we're able to utilize this data to really understand these are the highest priority corridors and areas that should be protected, then the communities will help decide that and then sign agreements around where there will be no logging or poaching or hunting, so that that is sustained for the long term. Challenges and obstacles, as always, customs is one of our biggest challenges. Just getting hardware into countries is, no matter how many times we've shipped and have dealt with this and have all of the paperwork and processes, inevitably, if different customs agents don't feel up for it, it can get stuck. So that's one of the challenges of this project so far, is just getting all of the hardware needed into the country. Another challenge for a lot of our projects is just getting the GIS layers that are needed for doing the different analysis, for doing the survey design. We're really grateful that we are going to get to work with Planet on utilizing their imagery for this project. So that's an awesome solution for that challenge as well. Next steps, this is a pretty new project. The first deployments are happening in January. So right now the survey design is being developed, the exact deployment sites are being kind of finalized, and then a lot of those trainings are starting to happen with the local communities and partners. So we will be looking forward to kind of collecting that first round of data in the beginning of next year, and then processing all of that and seeing what those initial results look like. And then deployments will also happen again about 6 months later, so that we can get that comparison between the rainy and dry seasons in Indonesia. So that's a little bit about Wildmon and one of the projects we're working on. I'm happy to answer any questions, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Chrissy and Wildmon. Thank you for getting into so much detail about the case study. I'll ask the first question real quick, because I know when we talked, you said you incorporated it as a nonprofit, and there were some advantages to that and probably some disadvantages. I wonder if you could speak to why you chose that format, how you're funded as well, and how you can interface with startups in the sector.
Yeah, that's a great question, and something we thought about some, but inevitably the goal for the organization is really to develop technology that is hopefully free, accessible, open for anyone to use. We like that there's funding mechanisms that help to support that are available to nonprofit organizations. And it doesn't really limit too much how we're able to cooperate with organizations who are not nonprofits as well. So that was chosen so that we can really, stay true to that mission of building out these pipelines and making them as accessible as possible. And then having access to things like grant funding, corporate CSR funding, those buckets of money that can help kind of put these tools into the hands of some of the less resourced projects. So that was sort of why we chose that. But still, yeah, very happy to collaborate and partner across different parts of the sector.
Amazing. Any other questions from everyone else in the room?
Super awesome. I can attempt next. Thanks, Chrissy, for sharing this. Super useful. How much of setup work is required, and at what scale does that make sense? And the context is we work with a lot of agricultural producers at their supply bases for a lot of basically quantifying the impact of their interventions, mainly to help them source funding by their supply chain partners or through other organizations. And I'm wondering, at what scale would something like this become viable to add as well in terms of what we monitor?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess to start out, the resolution needed of existing biodiversity information is not generally high enough for really accurate assessments of different practices that are being implemented on the ground. So in all of the projects that we're supporting so far, there is local data collection that is happening. I hope we get to the point in the world where we have enough standardized global data collection that we have existing models that can be used for projects, and that'll make it way more scalable, right? If we're able to have, standardized data collection globally, and we can use all sorts of advanced practices to make that accessible. But currently in the projects we're partnering on, there is data required to be collected from the field. Now, that being said, across project sites, it's not required to have data collected from every single point of the area you're trying to monitor. So a lot of what's looked at there is kind of how continuous is the application that is happening, right? Like if it's an agroforestry application, is the same practice being applied across a large landscape? Our team will then look at that and figure out what is the optimal survey design for that project, right? So sometimes you don't need sensors deployed across, huge landscapes. You can have a subsample of that, and then we can use different modeling approaches to extrapolate across much larger areas. So for agroforestry projects, for example, a lot of the time what we'll do is we'll capture data from traditional monocrop plantations or whatever is happening, then we'll compare to whatever application is happening across the agroforestry project, and then we'll compare that to nearby primary, secondary forest, and then we're able to kind of look at the differences across that. We can also use things like occupancy modeling so that we can combine that with the satellite imagery and GIS layers so that we can make assessments across larger areas without collecting that data across kind of your whole project site. So from a scaling up perspective, it's definitely possible. It depends. That can be kind of looked at, and then an optimal plan can be created around larger areas.
Thanks, that makes sense.
Nice. Anyone else want to raise their hands? Fernando.
Hi, Chrissy, everyone. I was just curious about the training phase. How could you talk a bit more about that? How do you do it? How do you plan it, and how long it takes? Things like that.
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. Thanks for asking that. It's an important part of what we're trying to focus on is actually building out the trainings so that local teams can execute on this, right? We don't want to have to send a team of experts to all sorts of different corners of the globe to actually deploy the technology, or longer term to actually do all of the data processing, right? So training sort of happens in a few phases. The first is on how to just use the hardware and get it into the field. So what that looks like is our team has a system that they use in which we'll train either remotely or in person the local teams. It's always important to have quite an organized team on the ground who's dedicated to doing the deployment. And our team will sort of walk through those leaders of that team, how to configure the devices, how to place them in the trees, how to make sure you have your locations marked, right? Best practices on making sure they don't get stolen, right? Some of those things that you have to walk through. And so there's a kind of training program that we implement, again, either in person, or a lot of them we just do over Zoom. And so the goal is always to have a team on the ground who can continue to do this long-term, because again, data collected long-term in a standardized way is what's really required to see what biodiversity over time looks like. And then we also have a training program for the actual utilization of the pipelines, and then the understanding of the results. So once our team will usually manage most of the process of actually analyzing the data, but then we try to hand off as much of that to local teams, build local capacity, partner with local universities, kind of whatever the project has to understand like how to continue to use these data training pipelines. And then from the results standpoint, how to actually interpret that and then implement that on the ground. So there's sort of multiple stages to the training process throughout the project itself.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions?
I have a question as well. I don't know, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So basically, my question goes along the lines of, or in the realm of what you do with your data. So basically, did you develop completely new methods, or did you basically scan public research to find good methods that you can deploy that are feasible and so on. Yeah, kind of your approach there. Maybe you can elaborate on that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. Nice to meet you. So our team has been working, we have the majority of our team is our science team, and across acoustics, camera trapping, and eDNA, they've been working in the field for quite a long time. So there's quite a few publications on methods that our team have developed themselves. But then we also incorporate, I mean, we're always looking at the research and incorporating new methods as well. So I would say it's probably a combination of some of the things that our team has designed and then also kind of best practices across the fields. A big part of that is how do you then implement that into the analysis pipeline, right? And so one of our biggest goals is figuring out how to take all of those methodologies and kind of automate as much as possible while keeping a scientist in the loop, to figure out how do we make this more scalable? Because if we don't do that, then it's just going to remain pretty inaccessible to projects, usually with quite limited funding on the ground, or projects that don't have scientific expertise or coding capacity, right? So the goal is how are we picking kind of the optimal methods and then working on automating those through our workflows as much as possible. And the goal is to make all of those accessible, free, open for conservationists.
All right, thanks.
Amazing. Any other questions? If not, then this is the point where we go into breakout rooms. It's so this is where I say if you don't want to be in the breakout rooms, leave now, say your goodbyes. Thanks to Chrissy and Carly. And if you do, then we'll just wait for a few seconds for everyone to kind of clear out that doesn't want to participate and then go into small rooms.
Chrissy.
Amazing sessions. All right. I think these are the people. Okay, so I'm gonna put Chrissy and Carly in separate rooms so you can all have someone from Wildmon there. And there we go. I'm gonna create about, how many are we? Okay, 3 rooms. And they should be opening now. So yeah, for the next 15 minutes or 20 minutes, the rooms will be open, so enjoy.